Hello, ADHD How-To here, and today we're going to learn how to play chess. So let's switch over to the board here. Chess is a game with 64 squares and 32 pieces to start. White always goes first. The point of the game is to checkmate the enemy king. What does that mean? That means we want to make sure that the king is threatened by another piece and cannot escape the threat within one turn. Okay, so that's great enough, but how do the pieces move? Great question. Let me show you. So we have 6 different kinds of pieces on the board. We have 8 pawns. Both players start with 8 of them in their second row. We have 2 rooks, one on each opposite side of the board on the first row, 2 knights, which is the little horsies here, 2 bishops, which are the weird looking things, 1 queen, which is the spiky one, and then the king, which is the one next to the spiky one with the cross on it. In terms of importance, it goes king, queen, rook, bishop and knight are tied, and then pawn. So if you lose your king, obviously you lose the game. So you don't want that to happen. If you lose the queen, she's the most powerful piece, so you're gonna be in a rough spot. But if you lose a rook, knight, bishop, or pawn, you're still pretty much in the game. So keep playing, even if you blunder. Now, how do they really move though? So the pawns move 1 square up at all times, 1 square only. However, when they're on their starting row, so the second row, they can move 2 squares. Only when on their starting row. Okay, that's the pawn. How about the knight? Now this one's pretty tricky. Knights move in an L shape. So if you make an L with your hand, your thumb is about half the length of your finger. So your finger is 2 times the length of your thumb, which is kind of how the knight moves. So the knight moves 1, 2 in an L shape, so like this. Or it can move 2, 1, also in an L shape. So knights are really tricky, especially for new players. Then we have the bishop, which is this piece right here. Bishops move diagonally. So they can move as many squares as they want, but only in the diagonal plane. So for example, if we have a dark square bishop, which this one here is, it can stay on the dark squares and move diagonally as far as it wants to. And then if we have a light square bishop, like this one, it can move as far as it wants on the light squares. Pretty simple. Next we have the rook. So the rook is the castle looking one. And the rook can move horizontally or vertically as many squares as it wants. So all the way to the right, all the way up, all the way down, etc. So you can move this wherever you want as long as it's not on a diagonal. Alright? And next we have the queen. The queen is the second most powerful piece, or rather, the second most important piece, because the queen kind of combines the bishop and the rook, because the queen can move as many squares as she wants horizontally, vertically, or diagonally. So that means she can get to any square on the board. She also covers the most squares of any piece. So if you look, each dot is the available space that she can move, and you see it covers almost the entire board. It covers half of the board. So try not to lose your queen when you're in the game. Alright, and next we have the king. The king is the most important piece in the game, but he's not very powerful because he can only move 1 square in each direction. He can move like the bishop or rook, vertically or horizontally, and he can move diagonally, but he can only move 1 square. So he's not a very fast piece, and saying that, you're not going to want to have him out in the battle like your other pieces. He wants to be tucked away behind some pawns in a corner, because if your opponent threatens him, then you could lose the game. Alright, so those were how the pieces move. But now I'm here to tell you about 3 special rules in the game. So there are 3 special rules in the game. 2 of them involve pawns, and 1 involves the king. So here's 1 special rule. Whenever the king can see his rook, so as you can see, there's no pieces in between the king and the rook right here. The king can move 2 squares over towards the rook, and the rook comes over the king like this. This is called castling. And you can do this once per game, because it's only when the king hasn't moved and the rook hasn't moved from the starting square. So even if the king was on his starting square like this, if you move somewhere else and then move back, you still cannot castle. Okay, so that's castling. And as well, you can do castling on the other side. So if you moved all of your pieces out like this on the other side, this is called queen side castling when you go the long way. The king can move 2 squares still towards the rook, then the rook will move over the king still. So this is queen side castling or long castling. Alright, so that's the first special rule again. The second special rule is, you might be asking, what happens if a pawn reaches the edge of the board, since they can only go forward? What happens when they reach the 8th row if you're white? Well, I'll tell you. So pawns can move, as we said, 2 squares when they start, and then 1 square, 1 square, but only forward. Now, I forgot to mention this, but pawns capture diagonally, so, but only forward, because they can only move forward. So when you want to capture the pawn, you can go to the top right or top left, and this is the only places they can capture. So let's go just top right here, and then top left. So what happens when the pawn reaches the edge of the board? Well, the pawn can become any other piece when it reaches the edge of the board. So the pawn, once it reaches the 8th row, can become a knight, a bishop, a rook, or a queen. Now, 99% of times, you're always just gonna make it a queen. So that's what we'll do here. Take the pawn off the board and add a queen. So this is called promoting a pawn. Alright, so that's the second special rule. The third special rule is called en passant. This is really, really rare. And like 9 out of 10 games, you're not going to use this rule at all. En passant is when you have pawns that are passing each other. So en passant literally means in French, in passing. So en passant, when a pawn moves from its starting square 2 squares forward, and there's a pawn on the second square, but in a row adjacent to it. So like this, if the pawn moved like this, and the white pawn was here or here. So it would also work if the black pawn moved 2 squares here and the white pawn was here. So when that happens, only on the move after, the black pawn moves 2 squares, and the white pawn can capture like this, which makes no sense, right? That makes, because the pawn didn't even move on the black pawn. So how can it capture it? Well, if you think in terms of chess, sort of, the pawn is like on these 2 squares at the same time for that one move. So you can capture it like that. But anyways, it's a rare rule. You won't see it 99% of the time. Okay, so that was all 3 special rules. Now let me show you how the pieces capture according to one another. So I told you how all the pieces move, and for the bishop, rook, and queen, you can capture literally just by moving onto an opponent's piece. So like the queen is here, she can move as far as she wants diagonally. So if we just move onto the bishop, you capture the bishop with the queen. That's all there is to it. And same with the rook. So like if we had our rook here and an opponent knight here, we could just move onto the knight, and that would capture the knight, and the knight would be out of the game at that point. So what about for our knights? How do our knights capture pieces? Well, the same way as rooks, bishops, and queens, they just move onto a piece. So we make an L with the knight, move onto the rook, it's captured. But knights do something special. They can jump over other pieces, because it's a horse, right? Horses jump over things. So you can have whatever pieces you want blocking the knight, right? But as long as an opponent's piece is within an L shape, it can still capture it. So the knights are not hindered by other pieces. Whereas if you had a queen, for example, if the queen was blocked by opponent's pieces, like this, for example, what if we wanted to capture the second knight? Well, we can't do that in one move because the queen can't hop over other pieces. So if we wanted to move to the right, we could only capture this first knight here, and then on the second turn, we capture the second knight, because we can't move in infinite direction if there's an opponent's piece in the way. So the opponent's piece blocks us, and we have to capture it if we want to move that way. Which leads me to something else, which is our own pieces can block each other. So let's say we have an opponent's knight here, we want to capture it with the queen. But let's say our pawn is in the way. Well, dang, we can't do it because you can't capture your own pieces, and except for the knight, you can't move over your own pieces. So this knight would actually be uncapturable in one move from the queen. We would have to move around the pawn, for example, like this, and then capture the knight in 2 moves. So that's the regular pieces. Now, what about the pawn? How does the pawn capture? Well, the pawn moves up, but it doesn't capture up. So if an opponent's knight was here, we could not capture this knight. This is uncapturable by our pawn. And in fact, the pawn can't move anymore because it's being blocked by this knight. And oftentimes in your games, you're gonna see pawns just like stuck together like this because neither one can capture the other, and they can't move forward because they're only allowed to move forward. So white would be wanting to go this way, black would be wanting to go this way, and so they're gridlocked. They can't move anywhere unless the pawns can capture. So if an opponent's piece, let's say just a bishop, was right here, now pawns capture, like I mentioned earlier, to the top right or top left. So this bishop would be capturable by the pawn, and unlike an en passant, you just move onto the piece. So just like this, the pawn just moves here, and now we've kind of freed ourselves from our deadlock. So now on the following turns, we can move forward and then promote to a queen if we want to. So that's capturing. And last thing, just the king can capture exactly as you'd expect him to. He just moves onto another piece, but only in the direction which he can go. Okay, great. Now we know how to capture. Let me move on to the last topic of this video, which is king safety. So the king is the most important piece on the board, which I said earlier, because if your opponent checkmates the king by, for example, let's say our king was here, just out in the open, a checkmate would look like, for example, if an opponent's rook was here and their queen was here. If it's my turn, my king is in check because the opponent's queen sees my king, which means the opponent's piece could move onto my king next turn if they wanted to, which they do because that's how you win. And my king cannot move anywhere to escape this check. So it cannot escape the vision of my opponent's pieces. The king can move 1 square in any direction, like we said. So the king's on the edge of the board, so he's stifled a little bit. He can move up, top right, left, bottom left, or down. So these 2 squares, or these 3 squares, are covered by this queen because the queen moves up as many directions as she likes. And these 3 squares, which the king can also move, are covered by this rook because the rook can move as many squares down as it wants to. So this would be a checkmate for black because my king is in danger and I can't move out of danger within 1 turn. So that is checkmate. Now let's look at a couple other kinds of checkmate. One would be if black moves like this. This is also checkmate for black because my king still cannot move up or down because it's covered by the queen because the queen can move diagonally. My king can't move diagonally because that's also covered by the queen here and the queen and rook here. So that's a no-go. So what if I capture the queen? Well, if I capture the queen, which I can't in this case because it's protected, but let's say I did, then the next turn the rook would take the king. So the king is not allowed to do do that. So you can't capture this queen because the rook sees the queen, and the queen is therefore protected by another piece. And so this is also checkmate. Now let's talk about check a little more. What is check? So if you're playing white, check is when an opponent moves their piece to where they can see the king. So what I mean by see is that they could capture it on the next turn if they want to. So black just moved the rook from this square to this square, and the rook can now see the king because it can move vertically. Now, in check, the king has to move out of check. So the king is here right now. We cannot go up because the rook could still see that square. So we would have to move on our turn. We need to get out of check to one of these 4 squares. Or additionally, if we had another piece on the board, like let's say our bishop could block the check. So if our opponent moved our rook here, we could use our bishop to block the check because the bishop can move diagonally to here. So that way the rook can't see the king anymore because the rook can't hop over pieces. So the rook can only see the bishop now, and the king is safe. Okay, so that's what happens if you get put in check. Now what about if other squares are covered? Let's say there's a knight right here. So a knight is here. Now where can the king move? The king can move only 3 squares here because the king cannot move into the bishop because that's your own piece. You can't capture it. The king can move to the left or top left because those squares are free and not protected by anything. The king can also move to the top right, but the king cannot move directly to the right because the knight is looking at this square because the knight moves in and out. So if we moved the king into this square, the knight could capture our king on the next turn and we would lose the game. So by chess rules, you're not allowed to move the king into danger. So this right here would be an illegal move because the knight can now see the king, and that is a no-no. Last thing about moving the king into danger. If you want to castle, by the way, let's say our pieces are all off their starting squares on the right side and we want to castle here. Well, let's say that our opponent's queen is blocking the angle. Let's say this pawn wasn't here either. So the pawn or the queen is looking down this file, which is another word for like column basically. The queen is looking down this file. So if we castled here, then the queen could capture the king. And as we said earlier, that's an illegal move. We can't do that. So we're not allowed to castle on the right side here because we'd be putting the king in danger. But what about if the queen was here? Could we castle here now? Because if you move the king 2 squares over, the king wouldn't be in danger anymore. Well, this is also actually a no-no because in one turn, the king is moving 2 squares, but it would be in passing in this square. So this is sort of like en passant, where a piece that usually moves 1 square, when it moves 2, it's sort of like it's in both squares at once for 1 turn. So this is a really weird thing to think about, but you cannot castle to the right here also because the queen is looking down this diagonal right here. And if we castled, if we move 2 squares over, the king would pass through that square, which is controlled by an enemy piece. So that is also an illegal move, and we'd have to wait or castle on the other side if we wanted to castle. Okay, my students, that is all I can teach you for today. If I were you, I would hop on the board and just play with a friend, play against yourself, and just find out what works, what's good. Or you could go on YouTube or something and find out different strategies or openings for the first like 5 moves or something. Because when you start, you have 20 legal moves, and it's hard to know what to do from here. So before you take on your friend or your crush at school who knows how to play chess, do a little bit more studying and it will pay off. This is such a beautiful game, and I'm so glad you got into it. Best of luck, my friend, and happy chessing. This is ADHD How To. Peace.